After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Imagine this Sunday a supermarket in downtown Toronto. A woman puts a bottle of Heinz back on the shelf and picks up a Canadian equivalent instead. No one said anything to her. No one urged her to do so. It was simply time to make a different choice. There are millions like her. In 2025, Canada began a boycott that no one officially announced. There were no rallies, no protests, no headlines, just silence and empty warehouses in the US. Netflix is losing hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Amazon is closing a distribution center in Quebec, cutting 700 jobs. In Idaho, potatoes are rotting in warehouses because McDonald's in Canada no longer needs them in the same quantities. At first glance, this is a chain of small decisions. Someone didn't go on vacation. Someone canceled their subscription. Someone chose a different ketchup. But when millions of people make decisions, the consequences become historic.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Do you think this is just an economic correction? Then listen to this. In the first 6 months of this year alone, more than 2 million trips by Canadians to the US were cancelled. This is not a pandemic or a state of emergency. This is a rupture. Soft, almost imperceptible, but fundamental. Canada no longer wants to be the quiet neighbor. It is voting with its wallet. And that vote is hitting the strongest American brands, from Coca-Cola and Tesla to Nike and even Oreo. Yes, even cookies have now become a symbol of mistrust.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The reason? Tariffs. Paper, dry lines in trade documents from Washington that supposedly mean nothing. But in Canada, they sounded like a slap in the face. Increased tariffs, veiled restrictions, signals that Canadian products are a hindrance, not a priority. And while the White House laughs, American goods are quietly disappearing from Canadian stores.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
This is not anti-Americanism. It is a new national consciousness. In 2025, Canadians aren't just changing their habits. They're rethinking their trust. They're giving up what once seemed unshakable: Big Macs, Tesla, Prime Video. And most importantly, they're doing it without shouting, without slogans. They're just not coming back.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't rely on. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
This video isn't about politics. It's about how trust is lost. It's about how every click, every cancelled subscription, every item left on the shelf becomes part of a major shift. Because if even Canada, the United States' most reliable ally, can turn its back in an instant, who's next? And more importantly, why hasn't America noticed this yet?
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
What you're about to see isn't just numbers. You will see what lies behind them: emotions, consequences, signals. And perhaps, for the first time, you will hear how the silence of one nation can be louder than any sanctions.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
It all started with small things. One refusal, one returned bottle of ketchup, one cancelled trip. No slogans, no banners, no loud speeches. In the spring of 2025, what economists would later call the largest silent boycott in the history of North American trade began in Canada. It was not an organized campaign. There were no leaders, manifestos, or social media campaigns, but its effect proved more devastating than any sanctions war. Ordinary Canadians, young parents, retirees, entrepreneurs simply began to turn away, not from the idea of America, not from Americans, from brands, from products, from the feeling that they were no longer being taken into account.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In Montreal, the owners of a small supermarket noticed that since the end of January, sales of American sauces and drinks had fallen by 35%. By February, this trend was growing. People started asking, is there a Canadian equivalent? Or where's the local milk? No shouting. Just a quiet shift. Orders for American wines disappeared. Boxes of Nike sneakers began to gather dust, and Tesla showrooms in shopping malls began to empty. In Vancouver, a young blogger protesting against American tax policy burned his Cybertruck live on air.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
The video garnered 18 million views and inspired a whole movement, Unfollow the Giants. Against this backdrop, the numbers spoke louder than any analyst. In the first half of 2025, Canada cancelled more than 2 million trips to the US.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
According to the Canadian Border Services Agency, 400,000 cars that used to cross the border every week are now staying in garages. This was a blow to American tourism, from Florida to Las Vegas, from New York to Arizona. Hundreds of hotels designed to cater to the flow of northern neighbors have been hit by a wave of cancellations. Car rental companies have begun to lose their fleets, and restaurateurs have complained about empty Fridays when their establishments used to be packed with Canadians. But while this was a significant blow to the tourism industry, it was a real crisis for American businesses. Netflix lost hundreds of thousands of subscribers in Ontario alone. In Quebec, Amazon closed a distribution center, laying off 700 employees. In Missouri, a potato factory that supplied raw materials to McDonald's was forced to cancel all weekend shifts. These seemed like isolated, unrelated events, but in reality, they were part of a single trend: disengagement, distancing, and loss of faith. And all this was happening against a backdrop of complete silence. No one in Washington was making any loud statements. There were no harsh press releases or threats. It all started with a new package of tariff measures signed in January. Without much fanfare, the US administration introduced technical adjustments to trade conditions. Visually, they looked like minor changes: slightly stricter certification standards, slightly increased duties on aluminum, wood, and processed food products. But between the lines, Canada read the main message: it was no longer considered a partner. There were no red stamps on these amendments, and newspaper headlines did not explode with the words trade war. But in every line, Canadians saw something familiar: humiliation. "We are not being taken into account," they said in an interview with CBC. "We are simply no longer important." Canada's trade minister, speaking in Parliament, called it a new phase of arrogance from Washington. However, there were no retaliatory tariffs in response. There were no diplomatic ultimatums either. There was only a consumer reaction. Across Canada, a silent shift in preferences began. According to a CNBC poll, 71% of Canadians said they plan to buy fewer American goods in 2025. Interest in local producers grew on social media. Hashtags such as Buy Canadian Again and Silent Exit began to gain momentum. Although no one coordinated this wave, people themselves were looking for ways to give up McDonald's, Oreo, Coca-Cola, and Heinz. Not because the taste had changed, but because the feeling had changed. In the small town of Regina, a local chain of coffee shops completely abandoned American chocolate, replacing it with products from Ontario. The owners admitted, "We lose a couple of cents on every bar, but we gain customer trust." In Calgary, children began collecting anti-brand stickers for their school backpacks: no logos, no American colors. And in Toronto, one of the largest shopping malls launched a Made Here, Loved Here campaign, designating areas for Canadian manufacturers only. Sellers noticed that sales in these areas increased by 28%. Meanwhile, in the US, all this was perceived as a temporary phenomenon. They said that Canada would get over it and the brands would return. But warehouses are closing in Pennsylvania. Jack Daniels is suspending production in Tennessee. In Illinois, Amazon is winding down regional contracts. And all this is not because of a sharp political conflict, but because of a creeping crack in trust. And while the White House continues to joke, Canadians are simply not coming back. They are not making a fuss. They are not writing angry letters. They are just crossing things off their lists. Calmly. Persistently. And this silence speaks louder than any sanctions. It all started with empty shelves and cancelled orders. But very soon the boycott, born in silence, began to have consequences that could not be ignored. While analysts argued whether Canada's behavior could be considered a deliberate action, alarm bells began to ring in American headquarters. In Jackson, Tennessee, at one of the Jack Daniels bottling plants, which had been exporting whiskey to Canada for decades, forced shutdowns were introduced for the first time in 22 years. The reason? Officially, it was due to a decline in orders, but unofficially, employees began to complain. Canadian shipments have dropped to zero, completely, suddenly, without warning. And that was only the first sign. Then the wave began to gather momentum. In Iowa, several factories that produced packaging for food brands reported suspending contracts with Canadian suppliers due to unpredictable demand. In Detroit, train cars loaded with furniture that was supposed to go to Canadian tire stores were sitting idle. Unshipped household goods, air conditioners, coffee makers, grill ovens were gathering dust in warehouses in New York. Some of them were branded by large American companies that had invested millions in marketing, but still ended up unwanted. While confusion reigned on the southern side of the border, Canada followed a clear logic: if they don't respect us, we won't buy from them. A string of McDonald's restaurants closed in Toronto. The official version was optimization. But locals knew that in recent months, no one had been going there. The city administration did not intervene, but gave the green light to new projects: burger joints using local farm ingredients and cafes with a 100% Canada menu. In Vancouver, A former Amazon warehouse was converted into a logistics center for small producer cooperatives. But the most painful blow to the US was not chain restaurants or delivery services. The boycott hit the image. The very feeling that an American brand is synonymous with prestige, stability, and reliability. Ontario saw a sharp decline in Tesla sales. More than 400 pre-orders for the Cybertruck were cancelled in a single month. Forums dedicated to electric cars were deserted. All the technological magic that Elon Musk had spent so long building simply ceased to be interesting. Not because it disappeared, but because in the eyes of Canadian consumers it was no longer theirs. A similar situation unfolded in the digital space. Netflix, which for decades was considered the second TV in every Canadian home, began to lose ground not only because of restrictions on account sharing. There was a growing feeling that the company did not understand the cultural and social realities of its northern neighbor. One high-profile case occurred in April, when Netflix removed a series filmed by a local director from its Canadian library. The company explained this as content restructuring, but it was perceived as a slap in the face. The director appeared on CBC, comparing American media platforms to idea vacuum cleaners that don't respect their sources. Within 10 days, 180,000 subscriptions were cancelled in Toronto and Ottawa alone. Against this backdrop, American brands began to resemble glass showcases, beautiful, famous, but no longer needed by anyone. And while they used to be protected by powerful infrastructure, marketing, and global recognition, all of that has now become an unnecessary burden. In Boston, the marketing agency GWE conducted an internal audit of its promotional campaigns in Canada and concluded 90% of advertising messages no longer work. The audience does not believe in friendly faces and cheerful slogans. They are looking for honesty, localism, and respect. In desperation, some companies even began to urgently disguise themselves as Canadian. They repackaged their products and came up with neutral brands, but even that no longer helped. All this exposed the most vulnerable point: logistics. Until 2025, Canada was one of the key links in the North American supply chain. Millions of boxes, railcars, and trucks traveled between countries as part of a finely tuned system. But in the middle of the year, that system broke down. In Pennsylvania, truck drivers who served Canadian routes were left without jobs. In Illinois, distribution centers began cutting night shifts. In Buffalo, a city considered the gateway to Canada, warehouses were filled with goods that no one was waiting for. The owner of logistics company Express North told Bloomberg, "They just stopped responding. The contracts were there, the phones were working, but no one was picking up on the other end. It was as if we had been erased." Analysts confirmed that of the 48 logistics points serving the Canadian market, 14 had completely shut down operations, and another 9 had gone into temporary shutdown. At the same time, everything began to change in Canada. Loblaw, Metro, and Sobeys, the largest retail players, bet on domestic supply. Instead of shipments from Vermont, there were now deliveries from Alberta. Instead of trucks from California, there were refrigerated rail cars from Manitoba. Across the country, integration between farmers, processors, and chain retailers intensified. Even those who had previously depended on the US began to look for new schemes through Europe, through Asia, through local initiatives. And if North American trade had previously seemed eternal and unbreakable, like the highway between Ottawa and Detroit, it was now creaking at the seams, silently, without any official breaks. But with all the destructive force of silent discontent, Canada did not declare economic war. It simply got up and left the room, and now more and more American companies are realizing that the door behind it may not open again. Canada has never been known for its sudden moves. It is a country of silence, of forests and lakes, of diplomacy and restraint. But in 2025, that very silence began to sound like a death knell. And it wasn't just restaurant subscriptions and logistics that found themselves at the center of this shift. In fact, something else was hurting even more: the loss of symbols. For millions of people, brands were not just product, they were memories, feelings, pieces of life. And now these symbols, from ketchup to electric cars, began to crumble, losing their magic before our eyes. In Lexington, Ontario, there once stood a proud sign: "Welcome to Canada's ketchup capital." A Heinz factory had operated here for decades until the company moved production to the US in the mid-2010s. At the time, it was simply a business decision. But in 2025, when imports from the US came to be seen, not as the norm but as a concession, this move was remembered with renewed vigor. Supermarkets saw a real revival of French's, a Canadian brand that had been displaced by Heinz and long considered an alternative. Now it has become a symbol. And it wasn't about the taste. People bought it because it was theirs. In Winnipeg, a school project even went viral. Children compiled a list of tastes of betrayal American products that had left Canada at a difficult time. This blacklist spread across social media with a silent call, "Don't trust them again." And in the US, the consequences began to unfold. In Ohio, one of Heinz's bottling lines began cutting shifts. The reason was simple: there was nothing to deliver. Machines stood idle, trucks remained unloaded. In Michigan, half-empty vans with brand logos were parked, logistics collapsing, because Canadian orders had disappeared. But if it were just sources, the economy would have survived. The problem is that the blow has hit things that have a much deeper meaning. One morning in Quebec, Jack Daniels disappeared from the shelves. No announcement, no loud slogans. They just stopped ordering it. The SAC and l'Elbow alcohol control agencies began quietly clearing out American product. They were replaced by local producers, French wines and Irish whiskey. Jack, once considered a universal spirit, became an empty shelf. And in Tennessee, at the factory where white oak is used to make barrels for aging Jack Daniels, a series of floating layoffs began. Officially, it was called restructuring. Unofficially, it was called Canada is closed.